Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of a Versucher on Hegel's Science of Logic. This is Chen, your friend, a cultural historian of early medieval Europe and late medieval China. Today, with me to discuss the Science of Logic is my dear friend Aran. How are you doing, Aran?
I'm doing good. Good to be with you guys. I'm Oran. I'm based in Austin. I'm an educator in philosophy, and I'm happy to be discussing Hegel Science of Logic with my friend Trent.
Yes, just to provide a very brief background for what we're doing here. This is the seventh episode of the whole very long and hopefully enjoyable series on Hegel's Science of Logic. For the past six one, we basically presented what Hegel, and also with some reflection as well as external resources to contextualize this project. And from today onward, we're going to dive into the text itself. So what's the subject of today? I think we have already introduced the significance and importance of Hegel's project and addressed the possible reaction towards it, and also provided our defense for this project in face of such a criticism. So what is left to be done other than
I think the only thing that is left to be done is to just actually do it. Because I think what we have discussed so far in the past six episodes is that we have, with engaging with the meta-level criticism of possible meta-level criticism of Hegel's Science of Logic, we have tried to show that meta-level criticism of Hegel's logic is not going to be sufficient. It's not going to be enough, in the sense that whatever is wrong with Hegel's Science of Logic requires engagement with science of logic. The reasons to reject science of logic from outside are not sufficient for it. And some of those problems were more probably applicable to philosophy in general, or even other projects of Hegel. And some were more specific about Hegel's project, like the point about presuppositionlessness of the beginning. So what we discussed so far has been that response. And that response, of course, was possible because we had to engage with some parts of Hegel's logic, or the beginning of the Hegel's logic, but we never really started the book. We didn't really delve into it, and that's what we're going to do. And the book starts with this interesting title, what must the science begin? Right. We're going to use this opportunity of the beginning of Hegel with this kind of an idea of the beginning, to also remind you, dear listeners, of something about the nature of this podcast channel, whatever you want to call it. Never forget our name. We are the Versucher. We're attempting. And one of the reasons we are attempting in this format is that we want to be allowed to revise, to modify, revisit. And because what we are undertaking here is something massive, and it is itself an attempt to absolute depth, we are going to revisit what we have talked about before continuously. So never think about our episodes as, a survey of the book, this book or that book. Think of it as an attempt. The name, there is a reason we have that name. We have attempted once, we will attempt again. And this process is going to get continued. And that what makes our discussions meaningful, in the sense that we are not only sharing our final, solutions to certain problems, but we are always aware of the flaws and the interesting questions that come out of those discussions. So what we want to do is to start from revisiting some points that we have talked about in the last few episodes, and they're not necessarily massive modifications. There are most clarifications, other than one specific point that Trent will talk about shortly. What I want to say here is, first off, we need to remember something that I'm not sure if we clarified this enough in our discussions, or it was even clear for us as much in the beginning. That when we talk about the beginning, right, you might think of beginning as, okay, this is a beginning of something that, okay, we know what's going to happen next. This is just the beginning of that. And, you know, all sorts of books could be structured that way. Like when you have like a beginning of an intro to chemistry book, you know, this is a beginning, meaning that this is going to get more complicated, more branches are going to come out. You know, the beginning is the beginning of that process. That's not Hegel's science of logic. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about it. The beginning is not a beginning of anything else. Actually, the beginning, just like any other phase of the book, is far more, to put it in more human sense, self-confident and self-assured to think of itself as the beginning of anything else. Any position in Hegel's science of logic thinks of itself as absolute, or thinks of itself as final, thinks of itself as complete. It doesn't think of itself as, you know, I'm just the beginning of this other thing that is going to come later on. It is violently asserting its completeness. And what happens is that it ends up being not complete, which we're going to discuss in details in this episode, next episode, of what that might mean. But it is important to understand that point about Hegel's logic, because remember that this is all about immanent development of concepts, which is, again, something that we're going to revisit here almost religiously in a few minutes. So that just means that there is no prediction of what is coming next. If there is no prediction of what is coming next, as someone who's taking the project seriously, then you don't know where's the beginning and where's the end. You just assert. That's the energy of the quote-unquote beginning of Hegel's science of logic. A beginning that is no beginning. Trent, could you tell us about the second point?
Yes, absolutely. That comes from a very helpful conversation we had, which was sort of unrecorded between Aaron and me, and we revisited certain parts of our previous recorded conversations, and I noticed there's a very significant difference in my usage of the term being and Hegel's concept of being. At that time, I was very intrigued by the fact that perhaps in early Chinese, the language, being was never encapsulated in a specific term and used at least as a center of a certain philosophical or value discussion. Therefore, I raise the question, to what extent is Hegel's project translatable across culture and tradition? And but then I was thinking of being really as a common denominator of existing entities, in that, like, interesting mental exercise that the kid asked his or her parent, like, what's a similarity between two, say, fruit pieces of fruit, then a fruit and like an object, that eventually we go to being as a substance, that common denominator approach. But for Hegel, it wasn't that, as has been very clear in our previous discussion, and it will be even clearer today, is as just pure immediacy. So in that sense, what we discussed about the translatability of that being as a common denominator does not really apply to this translatability, which I think, as we discussed, it has more to do with the concept between universal and particular, and hopefully Hegel would present his position as the whole project unfolds. But at this point, we don't need to take any position on that, as we talked about in the previous episode. So that's what we need to clarify before we proceed. Do you want to take up the next point or not?
Yes. One quick point as an extension of what you said. So what we talked about was this point about, like, we wondered about, you know, whether this is about, because we were talking about Gadamer and like that kind of a linguistic challenge of whether this is about German or is not about German.
Right.
And then we try to find being, the presence of being in other languages. But what we were trying to find wasn't the being of Hegel's logic. It was another type of being. Now, the same question could be asked about being as pure immediacy. Absolutely. But being as pure immediacy is is a very different thing to look for than
Right.
being as a common denominator of existing entities. And this point about translation is going to be with us, as you said, when we rethink this whole idea of universal individual in particular, from Hegel's perspective and other people's perspective. Now, the third point is kind of related to the first point that I introduced here, which is not so much a modification of a discussion that we had, but it's just a clarification, because we kept telling you guys that think of Hegel's science of logic as a massive critical overview of basic concepts, right? Like the some concepts, we have the concept of like whatever, something, other, being, determinacy, subjectivity, these concepts that are not only at the core of any sort of philosophical discussion, but they are presupposed in scientific inquiries, natural scientific inquiries, and even commonsensical views of the world. And we thought, we kind of like, when we're thinking about like the utility of Hegel's science of logic, one of the things that we mentioned was that this is going to be a critical overview of basic concepts. Now, we want to clarify that this is not a this clarificatory process is not like that, okay, chapter 1, Hegel says, okay, we have talked about being in this way. Let's just now reconsider what being is. And okay, there's chapter 2. Now we talked about becoming in this way. Let's just talk about that. It's not that Hegel is just like saying that, okay, let me just go look what kind of concepts we're using. What are these quote unquote basic concepts? And then let me just, reevaluate them. Not at all. Number one of the things is that how do you know what concept is basic and what concept is not? That seems to be a very huge presupposition. Number 2, the basic concepts prove to be basic based on the process they go through in the science of logic. And it's not so much about basic that it is whatever concept that comes on the way of the imminent development of science of logic. This happens to have an influence on very important concepts such as subjectivity and objectivity, truth and knowledge, being and nothing, something and other. Those are going to all be involved. But number 1, we need to think about them as part of this process, as a result, not as a direct purpose. But also we need to be aware, just like we mentioned about being here, that like it's not like Hegel is reconsidering the concept of being insofar as we understand being in the common way that we understand being. It's important to understand that being is a placeholder for an idea. Being is pure immediacy, and that is being reconsidered, not necessarily being as the common denominator of existing entities. That is going to be explored, but later. So don't get confused so much about the label of these concepts, and pay more attention to the content of what they are. Here, being is pure immediacy. So what we want to do here, and in this episode we want to emphasize on this point, and then so it's the beginning of Hegel's logic, right? And the beginning of Hegel's logic, to me, and maybe this is a futile hope, but I think it's the most complicated part of the book, because we are very, 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 very like off track of anything palpable. We're not talking about determinate existence. We're not talking about any sort of tangible. It's not going to be tangible at any point, but it's very far. It's very, very, very basic, and some very interesting questions come as a result of this. But given this complexity of the beginning of Hegel's science of logic is a ridiculously short. Like the first transition that happens in the book from being to nothing and nothing to being, I don't remember exact pages, but it's just like 3 pages. It's not like Hegel discusses this in just 50 pages. And what we want to do in this episode is to just tell you what happens as just, as reporters, and keep it kind of vague, and then tell you what kind of questions we have about this whole transition. And in the next episode, we'll try to unfold our understanding of what is going on here. So, being is pure immediacy, Hegel tells us, is pure indeterminateness and emptiness. And as a result, collapses into nothing, which is understood as, this direct quote from Science of Logic, absence of all determination and content, undifferentiatedness in itself. And Holgate tells us that being is thought, but it is too indeterminate even to be being, and so immediately vanishes. What is left is nothing. Before going to the third quote here, and then Trent will take over, I want you to kind of revisit another point in this whole book that to me is still rather unclear. And but I don't want to necessarily unfold anything here. But the point that the quote from Holgate shows us something, right? Being is a thought, but it is too determinate even to be being, and so on and so forth, right? So the way that Holgate presents this is that we are like the idea of science of logic is not just about being. It's just like thinking about what thought is, and the minimal way to have any sort of a view of what thought is to just think that thought is, in a sense that is purely immediately there. There is no difference between being and thought at that level. This level of indistinguishability, or at least essential sameness, is something that is going to be a problem for us, presented in different ways. But I think the last slide of our next conversation is going to be a better way to elaborate on this, and it's something that is gonna be there. That how much this really is palpable for making sense of the progress of concepts in the science of logic itself. But I will postpone that conversation for later. I think there's a good thing to there is going to be room for that discussion. But now I want to give Trent the floor to see what he wants to say, and also the point about Chinese philosophy.
Yes,
because he's Chinese. So
well, that's a matter of opinion, first of all. Now, I think one important and crucial background for us to provide here to our listeners is, why did Hegel raise being and subsequently nothing as the starting point? We started with a very, in our previous 6 episodes, we talked about the most unique part about Hegel's project is that its refusal of accepting received wisdom, or take certain thing as like fixed and unmoved, like grounding presuppositions. We spent like so many minutes to talk on grappling with that concept and talking about whether it's possible and things, and how did starting with being or nothing addressed that concern. So if we throw away all our presuppositions, then what we get is, according to Hegel, sheer immediacy. And that's why we must start with that. And in the next slides, we're going to talk about like how, or next conversation, we're going to talk about how it evolved. But So I would just wanted to reassure our listeners that being and nothing are not out of the blue. They are like forced by the very clear self-definition of Hegel's project. It could not possibly start anywhere else. So even though they are still fearfully abstract, we still, I can imagine like you as a listener to this must feel very out of your depth, or like in a state of bewilderment, just like I felt when I started reading this text. It's absolutely normal. Just bear with us, and I hope that in a couple of like conversations you would see why this makes sense in Hegel's sense. Okay, so the final point on the slide I'm going to talk about is Hegel seems to us, both of us, aware certain parallel between the beginning of, say, from nothing or pure being, as sheer immediacy, and some train of thought, not necessarily the defining or the dominant thought in early Chinese philosophy, as he himself mentioned in Science of Logic. I'm reading aloud the quote first. Now, the beginning should be made with nothing, parenthesis, as in Chinese philosophy, need not cause us to lift a finger. For before we could do so, this nothing would no less have converted itself into being. Sounds very esoteric to me, like being nothing. They're changing into each other. We're going to discuss what that really means in very short future. But here, I just want to draw attention to like the parallel between what he thinks the beginning with nothingness or being and the Chinese one. I am not entirely sure where he got his sources from, because I'm not a cultural historian of 18th century European reception of Chinese philosophy, but based on his lecture notes on so-called Oriental philosophy, where he treats Chinese as well as Indian philosophy in depth, and in my eyes, with a great insight. He focuses on certain strands of thought in early pre-imperial China, with a specific focus on Taoism, a follower of Lao Tzu. And there you had a famous quote, perhaps from chapter of Tao Te Ching, that is like the reason, or the Tao, according in translation of that time, beget one. 1, 2, and that one is the Tao is usually considered as nothing, or things of no extreme. Then eventually gives to the polarized version of like yin and yang, things of that kind. So that's certainly one strong parallel there. But whether this really speaks to the essence of Hegel's nothing, I'm not sure, because in Chinese thought, I don't think that nothing, as we will discuss, it really means what Hegel means, that is indeterminacy or lack of any qualification. So it's just an interesting thought for the moment, but one requires perhaps like further contextualization in that time, and also what he really wants to do with the lecture notes on Oriental philosophy. I don't really have really insightful things to say about this quote. Let's just move on.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because the part that kind of makes it interesting, because as you said, it seems like that whatever this being and nothing in Hegel's Science of Logic means does not, at least immediately, look like what they mean in Chinese philosophy, or Taoism specifically. But Hegel mentions it, right? And we don't need to think about whether Hegel like understood Taoism correctly or not, but it seems like that he understands that nothing is not necessarily what he is going for here. So yeah, I'm just fascinated by this parallel suddenly popping up at this point of Hegel's Science of Logic, that he mentions it, but without any sort of further elaboration. And maybe in our further conversations, and maybe even delving into Taoism, we can have a better grasp of what is the difference and what is actually happening here. Now, what we want to do at the end of this episode is to tell you, we have just given you a sketch of what is going on. Pure immediacy ends up being collapsing somehow, and it's not being anymore, it's nothing. And that seems to be the transition, and there is a return of this transition of nothing to being. And that's why it doesn't matter where you start, you just come back to one another, right? To the other. Now, this is still, of course, very abstract, and the details are needed. But to kind of like organize our thought of what this point about transition means, we have a couple of like layers of questions, right? One of the category of a problem, like issue that we have, is the point about immanence, right? Because remember that one of the things that Hegel aspires to do, like there are two things that I think makes Hegel's project very unique. Number one, he wants to start from no presuppositions, no founding presuppositions about being in thought, right? Which is something that hasn't happened, or hasn't happened in this way, that you suspend at that level and still have a willingness to continue. The second thing is that he wants to say that this is not, you cannot say that being as pure immediacy fails because, I don't know, because we are in the world of mediation. Some sort of an external criticism that doesn't take this idea seriously. But what does it mean to say that being as pure immediacy collapses immediately? It seems to, like, how does pure immediacy possibly transition into anything else on its own? It seems like whatever we want to do to pure immediacy, we need something external to pure immediacy. But if we need some external resources to make the movement from pure immediacy to something else, it doesn't seem that much imminent. Like if you need other concepts to use to make the transition possible, that seems weird, because it seems like we're presupposing something that makes the transition possible. If you're not doing that and we are just only focusing on pure immediacy, that doesn't seem to be a movable thing. There doesn't seem to be something that could possibly collapse or not collapse. What does that even mean for this to collapse into nothing immediately? And parallel to that, there is this question that if Hegel says, oh, it just collapses in so and so way, and that's imminent, how could one object to that, right? How could we escape from this weird space that this just becomes either empty or some form of truism that is just like, whatever you say stands? Like, what gives this a substance? And it seems like that if there is no way to object to Hegel's claim that the transition from being to nothing is imminent, he's full of crap, because he's just saying something that we cannot really deal with, we cannot really object to. I mean, he could react to objections in different ways, but if there is no possible way to say that he's wrong in thinking that being imminently collapse into nothing, then it seems like we have a problem. It just seems to be arbitrary. So that's what I have for immanence. Do you have anything for immanence, Trent?
No, not really, but I think we will revisit this like very shortly when we're talking about the transition from being in nothing to beginning, which will really put the whole process of imminent progress or collapse into focus. So stay tuned.
Yeah. So the second category of a problem that me and Trent have different routes to get to it, but it's somehow similar, is that when we're thinking about this kind of an imminent movement of being to nothing, or it being to what, or any other determination there, any other concept there. I've been thinking about what is moving, right? That's just a very basic point of it. And who keeps track of the movement? And in terms of like the consistency of the concepts or lack of consistency of concepts. Because if both sides of this like interpretation could run into problems. If we say that, oh, okay, this is only our concept of being that is moving. Once we think about being, that thought kind of like disappears into nothing, and so on and so forth. Then it seems like that we have already presupposed a lot of things, subjectivity, thought, as opposed to being, and so on and so forth. But if we haven't done that, we have to say that it is being itself that makes a transition to nothing. And that sounds a little bit odd. What does that mean to say that being makes a transition to nothing? Does that mean that being itself is unstable? Does that mean that being itself, not just our conception of it, has some inherent like flaw once understood as pure immediacy, right? Because that could be like another option. Like if you're talking about being, not just the concept of being, but we're understanding being as pure immediacy, and that is a thought, but being as pure immediacy is not sufficient for whatever reason, and that changes. But is that like a judgment about what are we judging here, and how are we keeping track of the transitions in this process? What is being moved? What is being changed? What is being retained? And this is another point that we hopefully can discuss more next time. Now, Trent, both to the second point, add anything that you have, and independent from that, take over the last point that we're going to talk about.
For sure. Yes, I like the way you categorize it as two options, which at this point the readers of this text are just left wondering which one is. One is with each stage of so-called imminent transition or collapse. For instance, being to nothing, and then nothing back to being, or to the next stage to becoming. We'll explain what that means in future episodes. Are we really moving being as such, or are we just moving our understanding of it? But the way I came to the same question, but in a different way, is if being, let's think about it as a set of experience that moved, it grows, yet it retains its so-called identity, remains recognizable and recallable at the end of stage, once it really understands what it is. It could recollect at every stage of transition. What faculty allows it to have so-called personification, that memory, that so that its own progress is not different from the progress documented or remembered in, or stored in the memory. So there seems a parallel process going on. One is the reader, through reading this text, is like conceptualizing and understanding being's progress. The other is being's progress itself. And the two are, according to Hegel, that's the impression I get at least, not separable. And let's see how that really works out that way. At this point, this is only a question. I don't know what really makes it identifiable and recognizable, yet still allows it to change very radically or to its opposite. And the final point, we talked about the possibility of a Hegel's project in our previous episode. One major factor there is a role played by language. And I raised this point just in every language that I'm aware of, And you, dear listeners, you can think of an exception, like definitely leave it in a comment, that every human natural language has the negation relationship expressible. And the negation presumes that there's one speech and it has the opposite. It's not a opposite or opposites or anything. It's one and only. So it's a one-to-one relationship. Therefore, you have from one to two that transition from like sheer immediacy as pure being. Then pure being, when whoever runs the immanent process will get the same result, namely nothing. And I will leave you to explain what is the difference between nothing and the not being. But for the moment, let's just focus on why there's only one destination and the destination. Could it be a reception of that natural language concept of dichotomy or polarization? Could it be in reality, let's just speculate wildly here, that being realizes that it's not holdable? We'll explain that in the future. What does that mean? It must collapse or must move, but it must move to one point instead of for the multiple possible destinations. That's my question. It seems to a certain extent influenced by the way, say, human mind functions as like natural languages that indicate, but we cannot have that category of a human condition or subjectivity in this project at this stage. So what justifies this so-called polarized thinking, or polarized development of being, more or less? Yes, that's my.
Yeah. So I think, like, with not being here, I just mean what you just said, that if for whatever reason, let's accept that being is pure immediacy for some internal inconsistency imminently collapses, it is a little bit suspicious that with this collapse, we immediately arrive at something that has this, negation in this pure way attached to it. That it seems like that we are arriving at the polar opposite, and why having that kind of an, like, if it's like Hegel is not a big fan of visualization, but if you just visualize this, it's just like it seems like that we have a line, and this is just there's the opposite line of opposite side of the same line. Like it's one-sided in the sense that it has one direction, not so much one direction, but one axis, let's call it, right? And it's just like this is just the end of one point and it's the end of the other point. It seems like it being in nothing. But what if this is like a three-dimensional space with just so many other things? Why we easily just arrive at this very clearly, in the common use of the word, polarized opposite of being? And I think when we start to talk in more details of what we think about this transition at the beginning of Hegel's Science of Logic, it's the general point, I think, actually, that we need to keep remembering that being and nothing and concepts of any other concepts that kind of emerge in Science of Logic, they are placeholders for an idea, right? Just like what we said about being is the common denominator of existing entities, which might be the way that we usually think about it. Being is a placeholder of pure immediacy. Now, if being is the placeholder for the idea of pure immediacy, then nothing also could be something that is not about any sort of polarized opposition, but it's a placeholder for another concept that is not necessarily polarized at all. I think this point about polarization may be resolvable if we don't focus on being and nothing, and think about pure immediacy and absence of all determination, right? Or indeterminacy. That would be a different type of a transition than being to nothing in a more quote unquote commonsensical way. I think for general picture of how the book begins and what transition happens there and what types of question we have done enough in this episode. So Trent, if you have anything to add, please do so. And after that, we could just jump into it.
Yes, I'm just excited to really jump into the present to our listeners what our post-digestion reconstruction of the whole process, basically reading between the lines of Hegel's very laconic and esoteric, not really but fearfully abstract text, and what we think is truly going on, like in our upcoming episode. Okay, thanks for listening, dear listeners, and stay tuned. We're still dealing with being and nothing and imminence in our next episode. Take care.
Take care.